The committee room fell silent as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stepped up to the podium, her voice steady and clear as she began presenting her evidence on voting rights violations. The air was thick with anticipation. Cameras clicked, pens hovered, and every eye turned toward the freshman representative from Texas. But before she could even finish her opening statement, Texas Senator Ted Cruz had other plans. Within seconds, he interrupted with a sharp point of order. A murmur swept across the room. Cruz, wearing his signature smirk, leaned back slightly, his eyes locked on Crockett like a seasoned predator ready to dominate yet another hearing. What happened next would shock everyone present. Cruz clearly believed he could steamroll the young Congresswoman using the same aggressive tactics he'd perfected over years of high-stakes political combat. In the first 10 minutes alone, Cruz interrupted Crockett 6 separate times, each attempt sharper and more aggressive than the last. But this was not a rookie easily rattled. Crockett had been preparing for this moment her entire career. When Cruz made his 7th attempt to silence her, what came out of her mouth would leave the entire committee speechless and turn Cruz's own strategy against him in the most devastating way possible. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, hit that like button if you want to see more political moments like this. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the latest congressional drama. Now, let's watch how a first-term representative from Texas managed to completely dismantle one of the most seasoned politicians in Washington. The hearing had been expected to be routine. The House Judiciary Committee had convened to discuss new voting legislation, and Crockett, serving on her first major committee, was presenting research she had spent months compiling. Her brown suit was pressed to perfection, her notes meticulously organized, and her voice carried the confidence of someone who had rehearsed her remarks dozens of times. But Ted Cruz was watching closely from across the room, arms crossed, eyes calculating. This was his arena. The Texas senator had built an entire career on moments like this, finding young Democrats, interrupting them mid-sentence, and turning committee hearings into headline-grabbing spectacles. At 53, Cruz was known as one of the sharpest legal minds in the Senate, someone capable of slicing through arguments with surgical precision, and Jasmine Crockett? She was everything Cruz loved to target. Young, passionate, representing a district that had flipped from red to blue. At just 33 years old, she was the kind of progressive voice Cruz had made a career out of challenging. A civil rights attorney before entering Congress, Crockett brought with her a courtroom toughness, but committee hearings were a different battlefield. This was Cruz's territory, and he knew it. As Crockett began reading her opening statement on voter suppression data, Cruz leaned forward, waiting for the perfect moment. He had performed this dance countless times. Wait, interrupt with a procedural objection, throw the speaker off rhythm, and dominate the exchange. It was a strategy that had served him well against dozens of Democratic lawmakers. The cameras were rolling. The room was packed with staffers, reporters, and advocacy groups. Everyone sensed that this was a high-stakes moment, one that could define careers. Cruz knew it. Crockett knew it. The tension was electric. Ted Cruz sat at the committee table like a predator sizing up his prey. His Harvard law degree gleamed in the background of his resume, and his years as Texas Solicitor General gave him the courtroom confidence to intimidate even seasoned lawmakers. He had argued 9 cases before the Supreme Court, written best-selling books, and run for president. Facing a first-term representative should have been easy work. He had built his political brand on exactly these kinds of confrontations. The constitutional conservative who could out-debate anyone, the legal scholar who could find the flaw in any argument, the master tactician who could weaponize procedure to control the narrative. His supporters loved nothing more than watching him dismantle liberal arguments on live television. But Cruz underestimated the opponent standing across from him. Jasmine Crockett had not stumbled into Congress by accident. Years as a civil rights attorney in Texas courtrooms had forged her into a formidable legal mind. She had faced hostile judges, aggressive opposing counsel, and juries filled with skeptics. She had won cases everyone said were unwinnable. Raised in St. Louis, Crockett earned her law degree from the University of Houston and spent years fighting voter suppression long before ever running for office. She was no stranger to powerful adversaries or high-pressure situations. If anything, the stakes of this hearing only sharpened her resolve. The voting rights legislation on the table that day could affect millions of Americans. For Cruz, it represented everything he opposed about federal overreach. For Crockett, it was about protecting the fundamental right upon which democracy depends. The proposed bill sought to expand early voting, increase poll monitoring, and crack down on voter intimidation tactics. Cruz had already signaled in pre-hearing interviews that he intended to expose what he called the radical agenda behind the legislation. He had studied Crockett's background, searching for weaknesses in her legal arguments. To him, this was more than a policy debate. It was an opportunity to score political points against the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. But Crockett had done her homework, too. She had spent late nights reviewing Cruz's previous committee performances, identifying patterns in his behavior, anticipating the interruptions and procedural tricks he favored. She knew he would try to derail her testimony, to transform the hearing into a constitutional debate rather than a discussion of documented voter suppression. The room was thick with tension as both sides prepared for the inevitable clash. Cruz's staff had briefed him on potential vulnerabilities in the Democrats' arguments. Crockett's team had prepared counter-arguments for every possible line of attack. The media was ready to capture every second of what promised to be a political spectacle. What neither side fully anticipated, however, was how personal the confrontation would become or how quickly Cruz's tactics would backfire against an opponent trained for exactly this kind of fight. Crockett had barely finished her first paragraph when Cruz struck. "Point of order? Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice cutting through her presentation like a knife. "I believe the witness is mischaracterizing the legal precedent she's citing." The interruption was classic Cruz, technically within the rules, but clearly designed to break her rhythm. Crockett paused, looked directly at Cruz, and calmly replied, "Senator, if you'll allow me to finish my statement, I believe your concerns will be addressed." But Cruz wasn't done. Leaning into his microphone, that familiar smirk spreading across his face, he added, "With respect, Congresswoman, accuracy matters in these hearings. We cannot allow misstatements of law to go uncorrected, even if they support a particular political narrative." The room buzzed with tension. Staffers looked up from their notes. Reporters leaned forward. This was exactly the kind of exchange that cable news producers dream about. Crockett took a breath and pressed on, moving to statistics about polling place closures in Texas. She had managed only 2 sentences before Cruz interrupted again. "Point of order," Cruz said, this time more aggressively. "The data the Congresswoman is presenting appears to be incomplete. Are we supposed to make policy decisions based on cherry-picked statistics?" A low murmur rippled through the room. Even members of Cruz's own party shifted uncomfortably. Interrupting once might be considered proper oversight. Twice in such quick succession was starting to look like harassment. Still, Crockett remained composed. "Senator Cruz, I appreciate your interest in the data," she replied evenly. "I have the complete methodology and sourcing available if you'd like to review it after I finish presenting the evidence." Her calm response seemed to frustrate Cruz. He had expected her to falter, to lose her train of thought, to hand him an opening. Instead, she handled each interruption like a seasoned professional. Crockett moved on to recent case studies of voter intimidation, her voice gaining confidence with every example. The evidence was damning, revealing clear patterns of suppression aimed at specific communities. That's when Cruz made his third interruption. "Mr. Chairman, I must object to the characterization of legitimate election security measures as intimidation. This kind of inflammatory language has no place in a serious policy discussion." The tension in the room thickened. 3 interruptions in 5 minutes was far beyond normal committee decorum. Some members exchanged uneasy glances. The chairman looked ready to intervene. Still, Cruz pressed forward. As Crockett shifted to evidence about poll monitoring, he interrupted a 4th time. "Point of order. The Congresswoman seems to be conflating poll watching, which is legal and necessary, with voter intimidation, which is illegal. This distinction matters." Crockett's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained steady. Senator, poll watching is indeed legal. Poll intimidation is not. The evidence I'm presenting clearly distinguishes between the two. The fifth interruption came moments later as she discussed federal oversight mechanisms. Mr. Chairman, Cruz said, his tone dripping with condescension, I think we need to clarify the constitutional limitations on federal authority here. The Congresswoman appears to be advocating for federal overreach that would violate state sovereignty. By now, the atmosphere in the hearing room had completely shifted. What had begun as a policy discussion was turning into a personal showdown. Cruz's interruptions were growing louder and more aggressive. Crockett's supporters in the gallery exchanged frustrated looks. Even some Republicans appeared uneasy with Cruz's tactics. But the sixth interruption was the most explosive. As Crockett began her concluding recommendations, Cruz slammed his hand on the table and declared, Point of order! This entire presentation is nothing more than partisan theater designed to justify a federal takeover of state election systems. We cannot allow this committee to be used as a platform for radical constitutional revisionism. The room erupted. Democrats demanded order. Republicans looked uncertain. The chairman called for calm. All eyes turned back to Jasmine Crockett, who stood at the podium, papers in hand, her expression unreadable. She had been interrupted 6 times in just 10 minutes. But rather than flustered, she looked ready. The freshman Congresswoman from Texas had come prepared for exactly this fight, and the next words out of her mouth would prove it. Her carefully prepared presentation had been shredded by Cruz's tactical aggression. Any normal witness would have been rattled, confused, completely thrown off balance. The systematic nature of the assault was obvious to everyone in the room. Cruz had methodically disrupted every attempt at a sustained argument, turning what should have been a policy discussion into a showcase of his own perceived intellectual dominance. The pattern was so blatant that even neutral observers began questioning whether this was legitimate. Oversight or simply political bullying? Dressed up as constitutional scrutiny, the physical toll of the constant interruptions showed around Crockett's eyes, the subtle tightening of her jaw. But what no one could see was the mental preparation that had equipped her for exactly this scenario. Years in hostile courtrooms had taught her that aggressive opponents often reveal their own weaknesses when they become overconfident. Cruz's escalating behavior suggested a rehearsed script rather than a genuine response to the content of her remarks. The mathematical precision of his pattern, 6 interruptions in just 10 minutes, made the choreography unmistakable. This wasn't spontaneous constitutional concern. It was carefully staged political theater designed to create viral moments and fundraising ammunition. But Jasmine Crockett was not a typical witness. She was a civil rights attorney who had weathered countless hostile cross-examinations. She was a politician who had defeated better-funded opponents. And she was a woman who had been underestimated her entire career. As the room finally settled into a tense quiet, Crockett looked directly at Cruz, set down her prepared remarks, and began to speak without notes. Her voice carried clearly through the hushed chamber. Senator Cruz, she said calmly, I can see you're very passionate about this issue. Since you have so many concerns about my presentation, perhaps you'd like to present your own evidence about voting rights in Texas. Cruz smiled his familiar smirk. This was the opening he'd been waiting for, a chance to seize control of the hearing and launch into his own prepared talking points. He leaned toward the microphone, ready for his 7th interruption. Congresswoman, since you mention evidence, let me tell you about the real evidence of voter fraud and election irregularities. But before he could finish, Crockett raised her hand and spoke over him, her voice cutting through his sentence like a blade. Senator Cruz, with all due respect, you've interrupted me 6 times in the past 10 minutes. I believe it's time you learn what the word respect actually means. The room went dead silent. Cruz froze, his mouth still half open. For the first time, he had been interrupted, and the shock registered on his face. Crockett continued, her voice now firm and commanding. You want to talk about evidence, Senator? Let's talk about evidence. You've mentioned election security 6 different times during your interruptions. So let me ask you directly, can you provide this committee with concrete evidence of voter fraud in Texas that would justify the polling place closures I was discussing? Cruz tried to recover. Congresswoman, there are documented cases of irregularities. I asked for evidence, not talking points, Crockett said, cutting him off again. Do you have specific data about voter fraud rates in Texas? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Cruz hesitated. Well, the issue is more complex than simple fraud statistics, so that's a no, Crockett replied evenly. You don't have evidence of fraud that would justify closing polling locations in predominantly minority communities. You've interrupted my presentation 6 times to challenge data you haven't even reviewed, while offering no evidence of your own. The tension in the room was electric. Staffers scribbled notes at frantic speed. Reporters leaned forward, straining to capture every word. This was the moment no one had anticipated, but everyone had hoped for. Crockett wasn't finished. She turned to the committee, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had found her rhythm. Mr. Chairman, I've spent the last 10 minutes being interrupted by someone who claims to care about accuracy and evidence, but who cannot provide any evidence for his own claims. Senator Cruz has made this hearing about his performance rather than the serious issue of voting rights. Point of order, Cruz began. No, Crockett said sharply, cutting through his attempt. Senator, you've had your 6 chances to make points of order. Now it's time to listen. The power dynamic flipped instantly. Cruz, who had controlled the first 10 minutes with aggressive interruptions and procedural tricks, suddenly found himself on the defensive. His usual weapons, intimidation, procedural manipulation, rapid-fire objections, had been neutralized by someone who knew exactly how to counter them. Crockett returned to her notes, but instead of resuming her original statement, she addressed each of Cruz's earlier interruptions one by one. Senator Cruz questioned my legal precedent citations, she said, placing a thick binder on the table with a decisive thud. I have the case law right here if he'd like to review it. He questioned my data methodology. Here are peer-reviewed studies from 3 separate universities. He questioned my characterization of voter intimidation. Here are sworn affidavits from affected voters. Each document landed on the table with a crisp, satisfying sound. The visual contrast was undeniable, Crockett offering concrete evidence while Cruz had nothing but rhetoric. But what I don't have, Crockett continued, is any evidence from Senator Cruz supporting his claims about election fraud or the necessity of the restrictive measures he defends. What I don't have is any substantive policy alternative from someone who spent more time interrupting than listening. Cruz's face flushed deep red. He made one last attempt to reclaim control. Congresswoman, if you understood constitutional law, I practiced constitutional law before I came to Congress. Crockett cut in, her voice sharp as a blade. I argued voting rights cases in federal court while you were writing fundraising emails about them. So please don't lecture me on constitutional law when you can't even follow basic committee procedure. The room erupted. Democrats burst into applause. Republicans sat in uneasy silence. Even the chairman struggled to maintain a neutral expression. But Crockett had one final blow. She lifted a thick folder from her table and held it high for all to see. Since Senator Cruz is so concerned about evidence and accuracy, let me share some evidence with this committee. This folder contains voting data from Senator Cruz's own 2018 re-election campaign. It shows that his campaign relied heavily on early voting, mail-in ballots, and extended polling hours, the exact same voting methods he now claims are security risks. Opening the folder, she read specific figures. Senator Cruz received 287,000 early votes in Harris County alone. His campaign sent mail-in ballot applications to senior communities across Texas. His staff worked to extend polling hours in counties where his support was strong. The hypocrisy was undeniable, laid out in black and white with Cruz's own campaign data. So, Senator, Crockett said, snapping the folder shut, which is it? Were the voting methods that helped elect you to the Senate legitimate and secure? Or are they the fraudulent security risks you claim they are today? Silence blanketed the chamber. Cruz opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had been caught in a contradiction, exposed by the very tactics he had tried to use against her. Senator, Crockett concluded, locking eyes with him, you've interrupted me 6 times today. But your 7th attempt just proved my point better than any presentation I could have given. When politicians attack voting rights while relying on those same rights to win their own elections, that's not constitutional principle. That's political hypocrisy. The Democratic side of the room erupted in applause. Even a few Republicans shifted uncomfortably at the spectacle of Cruz's unraveling. The chairman called for order, but the damage was already done. The smirk that had defined Cruz's interruptions was gone, replaced by the stunned look of a man whose strategy had been dismantled in public. The immediate aftermath crackled with energy. Crockett's takedown of Cruz rocketed across social media like a political supernova. Within minutes, the phrase, 6 interruptions, became a rallying cry for viewers fed up with performative grandstanding. Clips of Crockett calmly declaring, "Senator, you've had your 6 chances," were being shared thousands of times every single minute. The data behind the viral surge revealed something deeper about modern political engagement. Younger users, especially those under 35, amplified the moment with captions about generational change and the need for fearless leadership. Older viewers gravitated toward the policy stakes, reposting Crockett's evidence on voting rights. Women of all ages reacted with particular force, celebrating a female lawmaker who had not only endured but mastered a sustained display of male aggression. International commentators joined the conversation, holding up the exchange as a cautionary tale and a model for democratic debate worldwide. Parliaments in Europe, Asia, and Latin America dissected the clip, asking whether their own systems allowed similar abuse of procedure and how Crockett's strategy might translate. Abroad, mainstream media moved with equal speed and far less mercy for Cruz. Seasoned political analysts, long accustomed to his sharp committee theatrics, called it the worst defeat of his career. The contrast was brutal. Ted Cruz, a Harvard-trained constitutional lawyer, dismantled by a freshman representative armed only with preparation, case law, and the senator's own campaign data. Progressive organizations pounced instantly. Voting rights groups began cutting ad spots before the hearing even adjourned. Fundraising emails, complete with Crockett's mic drop line, flooded inboxes within hours, driving a spike in small-dollar donations. Democratic strategists framed the confrontation as proof that facts and composure could still pierce the noise of partisan theater, but the impact went far beyond one bad day for Ted Cruz. Law schools uploaded the video to course portals as a masterclass in cross-examination. Political training programs broke down Crockett's pacing, tone, and evidence deployment for young candidates. Communication coaches analyzed her body language, the steady eye contact, the deliberate pauses, as an object lesson in how to command a hostile room. Women preparing to enter politics treated the clip as required viewing. Campaign managers dissected how Crockett flipped the power dynamic, refusing to yield to condescension or procedural bullying. Professional development seminars for lawyers highlighted her ability to turn an adversarial hearing into a controlled presentation of facts. Young attorneys studied how she pivoted from defense to offense, using Cruz's own interruptions to structure her rebuttal. Aspiring politicians of every stripe reached out to her office for guidance, eager to learn the tactics that had reduced a seasoned senator to stunned silence. Even Capitol Hill insiders took note. Staffers from both parties quietly acknowledged that the landscape had shifted. The old intimidation playbook, rapid-fire interruptions, procedural traps, manufactured outrage, looked suddenly outdated against a new generation of leaders trained in the age of viral accountability. Meanwhile, the voting rights legislation at the center of the hearing gained unexpected momentum. Crockett's methodical demolition of Cruz's arguments exposed just how thin the opposition's evidence really was. Several undecided committee members privately admitted they were swayed by her relentless focus on documented facts. Cruz's team scrambled to contain the damage. Press releases claimed he had been making important constitutional points and that the media was distorting the exchange. But the unedited video spoke louder than any press statement. No spin could disguise 6 failed interruptions, followed by a public, data-driven dismantling. Conservative media outlets tried to mount a defense, yet even some of Cruz's usual allies sounded uneasy. A few right-wing commentators chastised him for walking into a trap and underestimating his opponent. For a politician who built his brand on unshakable debate skills, the criticism from friendly fire was almost more damaging than the applause from progressives. The long-term implications were unmistakable. Cruz's aura as an untouchable debater took a measurable hit. Future witnesses arrived at hearings better prepared, aware that someone had already broken the Cruz code. Crockett, on the other hand, saw her national profile explode overnight. Major networks scrambled for interviews. Speaking invitations poured in from universities, advocacy groups, and legal associations. Her confrontation with Cruz quickly became a case study in political communication and evidence-based persuasion. Most importantly, the hearing changed the culture of congressional debate itself. Senators and representatives who once relied on aggressive interruption began to hesitate, aware that the next viral clip could capture their tactics backfiring. Crockett's performance proved that with preparation, precision, and unflinching composure, a single freshman lawmaker could rewrite the rules of power, live, on camera, and in front of the entire world.